In June 1940, as the Battle of France drew to a chaotic close, hundreds of thousands of German soldiers found themselves overwhelmed by events far beyond their control. Rumors of brutal reprisals, starvation, and harsh treatment at the hands of the British filtered through the ranks. They had been indoctrinated to believe that British captors were ruthless, calculating, and cruel, a people shaped by decades of imperial power and wartime cunning. Many expected humiliation, harsh discipline, and a confrontation with a level of hostility that matched the darkest propaganda they had been fed. Fear, certainty, and preparation for the worst dominated the soldiers' minds. Every marching step toward captivity was shadowed by anxiety, every whispered conversation tinged with dread. German military training, by design, left little room for uncertainty. Soldiers were taught to anticipate the enemy's brutality and to regard captivity as a prolonged trial, a test of endurance under dehumanizing conditions. Nazi propaganda amplified these fears. Leaflets, posters, and speeches insisted that the British were merciless, feeding a narrative of a civilization hardened and perverted by the First World War, by colonial conquest, and by their supposed love of order over human life. Soldiers were told to expect cages, malnourishments, and psychological torment. They were convinced that their faith in discipline and comradeship would be the only refuge in an otherwise hostile land. The reality of approaching Britain was entirely different from anything the soldiers imagined, yet at first it reinforced their fears. Crowded trains transported prisoners from the front lines, rickety and exhausting, through regions scarred by retreat and bombing. These journeys were punctuated by military police who oversaw the prisoners with rigid attention, sometimes stern, often silent. Rumors traveled fast. Whispers of violent interrogations and punitive measures circulated in the darkness of train compartments. Each rattle of wheels and groan of metal strengthened the expectation that the next step, arrival in Britain, would be a confrontation with savagery. The soldiers clutched to what they knew: fear, preparation, and the stories drilled into them since their youth. In the crowded transport, the air was thick with unease. Men spoke quietly about what they had heard from older soldiers or through rumors from captured comrades. Stories of harsh British camps on the Channel Islands, tales of prisoners beaten for minor infractions, and imagined exercises in cruelty filled the conversations. Yet there were no confirmations. All they could do was speculate. The uncertainty created a psychological pressure, a layering of fear upon fear. In this state, anticipation itself became a torment. Their minds, trained to expect the hostile world, framed every noise, every glance as potential evidence of impending punishment. By the time they reached the ports for embarkation, many German POWs were exhausted, both physically and mentally. Weeks of retreat, marching, and hurriedly organized defenses had left them drained. For some, the prospect of crossing the channel was terrifying. It was not merely a geographical boundary, it symbolized a psychological threshold into unknown territory. Beyond the gray waters lay a land they had been taught to fear, a nation whose reputation for discipline and order had been twisted into a narrative of hostility toward any captured German soldier. For the youngest and least experienced, this was their first confrontation with a world that did not conform to military maps or propaganda pamphlets. The embarkation itself was methodical, organized by British authorities who adhered strictly to international conventions regarding the treatment of prisoners. At the docks, soldiers were counted, documented, and herded into ships that would carry them across the channel. The process was efficient but unfamiliar. There was no shouting, no taunting, no attempt to humiliate. The soldiers, however, were primed to interpret any deviation from violence as cunning or trickery. If captors were calm, it must conceal something worse. If procedures seemed orderly, it could be a trap. Their minds, steeped in expectation of cruelty, filtered reality through suspicion. The anticipation of brutality shaped their perception even before the first step was taken onto British soil. The crossing itself was marked by physical discomfort and mental strain. Ships were crowded, movement restricted, and the constant rocking of the channel left many feeling seasick. Yet, even in these conditions, there was no overt aggression from British personnel. Soldiers found themselves under the watchful eyes of men who maintained distance but spoke politely when necessary. This politeness was confusing, almost alien, as it contradicted every expectation they had. Some POWs noted the lack of shouting or threats. Others remarked on the careful attention given to counting prisoners and providing basic necessities. But suspicion persisted. Calmness could be a mask, efficiency could hide cruelty. Every step reinforced a strange tension. They were captives, yet treated with a measure of respect their indoctrination had forbidden them to expect. As the coast of southern England approached, the landscape offered no clues to the horrors anticipated. Rolling fields, small villages, and the occasional town hinted at a peaceful countryside, unscarred by the immediate horrors of frontline combat. Soldiers, trained to see the world as a battlefield, struggled to reconcile their expectations with the scenery. They had been prepared for ruins, bombed-out ports, and hostile civilians lining the streets. Instead, they saw farmland, tidy hedgerows, and the distant glint of church spires. It was not beauty that disarmed them, but its ordinariness. There was no sign of wrath, no evidence of anticipated punishment. The mind, conditioned to fear, began to register cognitive dissonance even before the first foot touched British soil. The disembarkation process amplified this tension. Soldiers were guided from the ships into holding areas at ports where documentation and registration occurred. Guards were present, yet there was no display of force beyond what international law required. Men were photographed, searched, and directed to temporary quarters. Meals were distributed on metal trays, water and tea offered, and medical attention provided when necessary. The meticulous care for these prisoners contradicted every tale they had been told. And yet, because of their expectations, many interpreted these actions as psychological maneuvers, attempts to lull them into complacency before eventual punishment. The uncertainty weighed heavily on their minds. Even generosity became suspect. Transport from the ports to permanent camps was conducted by train or truck, often in open-air carriages designed for groups of prisoners. Here again, behavior of the British personnel puzzled them. Conductors and guards followed regulations, maintained order, and occasionally offered small courtesies, such as explaining procedures or providing blankets. The prisoners' minds, focused on survival, could not accept kindness at face value. Each act of civility was analyzed, weighed, and mistrusted. The soldiers were trapped in a psychological loop, expecting brutality, witnessing calm, and interpreting normality as strategy. This tension became part of the prisoners' daily reality, shaping every observation, every interpretation of their new environment. Upon arrival at initial reception camps, the German POWs encountered facilities that were clean, organized, and functional. Barracks were sparsely furnished but adequate. Meals were simple yet sufficient. Medical care was available. Officers and enlisted men alike were treated according to rank, reflecting a system of order rather than cruelty. Guards enforced rules, but their demeanor was professional, not vindictive. For many prisoners, this was disorienting. The mind trained for extreme adversity struggled to process a system that adhered strictly to conventions of humanity. Doubt began to creep in. The black and white image of a merciless Briton was confronted with shades of gray, procedural, regulated, and surprisingly benign. Even within the reception camps, psychological strain was evident. Soldiers whispered among themselves, comparing notes and stories of expected horrors. Some could not reconcile their experiences with the warnings they had received from Nazi propaganda. Others, steeped in obedience and discipline, simply accepted the discrepancy without questioning it openly, fearing reprisal from comrades or superiors for perceived weakness. The social dynamics of captivity reinforced a culture of cautious interpretation. Observing kindness could provoke suspicion, and observing routine could provoke anxiety. The prisoners' minds were caught between the rigidity of training and the fluidity of unexpected reality. The initial nights in the camps magnified the uncertainty. Sleep, for many, was difficult. The absence of anticipated aggression left a vacuum that the imagination filled with hypothetical threats. The body relaxed, but the mind did not. Every knock on the door, every shouted instruction, every movement of guards was analyzed for hidden meaning. Prisoners recorded these observations in diaries and letters, often noting the incongruity between expectation and reality with a mixture of confusion and disbelief. These records would later serve historians as windows into the complex psychological state of men trained to anticipate cruelty, yet confronted with surprising civility. By the time permanent camps were reached, the prisoners had already begun to experience the first cracks in their mental framework of what captivity meant. They observed orderly barracks, clean facilities, and meals provided on schedule. Guards interacted with them without malice. Officers adhered to regulations. Civilian workers who maintained the camps behaved predictably and politely. And yet, despite the absence of brutality, tension remained. Anticipation of cruelty had been ingrained. Expectation of harshness shaped interpretation. The mind, trained for hostility, could not simply accept normality. Each small act of decency provoked a mental negotiation. Was it genuine or a prelude to hidden punishment? The psychological groundwork of indoctrination was still very much alive. Approaching the heart of the camp, the soldiers noted the division between ranks, the organization of labor details, and the visible routines of daily life. Even the simplest chores were structured. Washing, cleaning, distributing meals, and roll calls followed strict schedules. This precision, rather than calming anxiety, sometimes intensified it. It suggested a form of control, subtle, comprehensive, and inescapable, that differed from the overt aggression they had anticipated. For some, this was comforting. For others, it was unsettling. The expectation of a chaotic, cruel system was being replaced by a predictable, measured one. Yet the brain, trained to fear disorder, found order itself to be ambiguous. Was predictability a kind of subtle torment? Was the absence of cruelty a trap? These questions lingered. As the first day in the camp ended, the prisoners faced another dissonance: the lack of immediate confrontation with hostility. Meals had been distributed without incident. Guards were professional. Fellow prisoners shared observations, but no panic. Some POWs began to notice the faint sounds of life beyond the camp fences: birds, distant conversation, even the rhythm of civilian activity in nearby villages. These auditory cues, ordinary to an outside observer, struck the soldiers as incongruous. A society functioning without immediate aggression toward them was alien. The human mind, conditioned to expect malice, struggled to process these signals. Sleep returned fitfully, haunted not by fear of direct attack, but by the strange anxiety of uncertainty. By the second day, routines were established. Roll calls, work details, and basic hygiene tasks were introduced. Officers explained regulations, often in clear, calm language. Meals continued to be served on schedule. Guards monitored movements, but enforcement was measured, devoid of the theatrics of cruelty expected by the POWs. Yet this calm did not lead to relief. The psychological impact of expectation was cumulative. Soldiers continued to analyze every act of the British staff. Politeness was suspicious. Efficiency was suspect. Silence was oppressive. The prisoners had been trained to see the enemy as unpredictable, dangerous, and malicious. Now, confronted with predictability and decency, their minds struggled to reconcile propaganda with experience. Letters and reports from the prisoners during this period reveal striking observations. Many commented on the orderliness of the camps, the adequacy of food, and the general civility of the guards. Others noted the quiet, almost eerie calm of daily life. For soldiers prepared for confrontation at every turn, this environment produced a different kind of tension, a slow, grinding uncertainty rather than immediate fear. The contrast between indoctrinated expectation and lived reality created mental friction. Anticipation of brutality had been a constant companion. Its absence now required cognitive adjustment. The prisoners were beginning, unknowingly, to encounter the first signs of psychological shock. As the day drew to a close, small incidents highlighted the divergence between expectation and reality. A guard might smile briefly at a group following instructions. Food distribution continued without contention. Work details moved in rhythm, with no threats or punishment. Even minor mistakes by prisoners were met with measured correction rather than abuse. These seemingly trivial observations produced a profound internal effect. The rigid framework of fear, built over months of propaganda and training, faced subtle erosion. The soldiers' confidence in the anticipated narrative of British cruelty was tested incrementally. Each orderly action, each act of professional courtesy, represented a tiny challenge to their conditioned perception of the enemy. By the evening, the soldiers had been inside the camp for several hours, enough to observe patterns and begin forming judgments. Yet the full implications were still beyond immediate comprehension. Their training, indoctrination, and expectation of brutality had created a lens through which reality was filtered. The mind could not simply absorb kindness, it had to analyze, question, and interpret. The arrival in Britain was not the climactic moment of punishment they had feared, but neither was it easily comforting. The tension between expectation and experience created a mental landscape in which confusion, disbelief, and anxious anticipation coexisted. And so, as night fell over the camp, the German POWs remained on edge. They had crossed the channel, endured the uncertainty of transport, and entered a system that operated efficiently, predictably, and with surprising decency. Yet, the mind trained to expect cruelty struggled to adjust. The tension between indoctrinated belief and observed reality lingered in every thought. The prisoners lay awake, listening to sounds that should have reassured them, yet somehow deepened the unease. Their journey had reached British soil, but the psychological confrontation, the dissonance between what was expected and what was real, was only beginning. Each soldier faced the silent question: what would come next in a world that defied every assumption they had carried for months, even years? As dawn broke over the reception camp, the German POWs awoke to a world that contradicted every expectation they had carried across the channel. The sun rose on tidy barracks, the faint scent of morning dew mingling with the aroma of cooking fires. Soldiers stirred, preparing for roll call and work details. And yet, there was no shouting, no harsh commands, no evidence of the cruelty they had been trained to anticipate. For many, the first moments outside the confines of the barracks produced a disorienting tension. Their senses confirmed reality, yet their minds remained anchored in expectation. The discrepancy itself was unnerving. The first meals were served with quiet precision. Metal trays held porridge, bread, and a modest portion of meat. Hot tea was poured in measured amounts. Officers and enlisted men observed the distribution, noting the orderliness and the absence of insult or intimidation. For soldiers trained to interpret every interaction as a test of endurance, the calm civility was perplexing. Some expected the trays to be overturned, or for guards to berate those who reached for their food too quickly. Instead, routine prevailed. Hunger had been a constant companion during the retreat, yet now it was met not with deprivation, but with basic sustenance. The mind, conditioned to perceive hostility, struggled to process the simplicity of adequacy. As the prisoners moved to their first work details, the contrast intensified. Tasks were assigned with clarity, explained in calm language, and monitored without aggression. Some men were sent to maintain the campgrounds, sweeping streets, repairing fences, or tending small gardens. Others worked in kitchens, laundries, or workshops, following established procedures. There was effort, certainly, and there were rules, but the environment lacked the expected vindictiveness. The soldiers noticed small gestures: a guard offering guidance to perform a task correctly, a fellow worker sharing tools without dispute, a senior officer walking among the men without intimidation. These details, minor yet persistent, began to chip away at the framework of fear constructed over months of propaganda. The POW's confusion was compounded by the absence of chaos outside the camp. From the barracks and work areas, they could see villagers moving about their daily routines, farmers tending fields, and children playing in open spaces. The normalcy was both alien and unsettling. They had been told that Britain was a hostile land, filled with people eager to humiliate and punish them. Instead, life continued as if the war were distant, almost abstract. The soldiers' minds, trained to expect surveillance, aggression, and punishment, struggled with the ordinariness of human behavior in a land that had supposedly been their enemy in extremis. Letters and diaries from this period reveal the complexity of their internal states. Soldiers described moments of disbelief, noticing the cleanliness of latrines, the adequacy of clothing, the consistent routine of mealtimes. Some recorded brief encounters with guards who spoke politely, or with fellow prisoners who maintained order without confrontation. Yet there was no relief. The human mind, primed for adversity, perceived calm as deceptive. Politeness could be a prelude to cruelty, efficiency a hidden instrument of control. The dissonance produced a unique psychological strain. The prisoners were neither threatened nor comforted. They existed in a liminal space between fear and the unsettling neutrality of unremarkable reality. During the first weeks, small incidents intensified this mental strain. A prisoner failing to follow an instruction precisely would receive measured correction rather than anger. A misstep in a work detail might elicit a calm reminder rather than punishment. These acts of ordinary management provoked intense internal conflict. Men questioned their assumptions. Could it be that the enemy they had been taught to fear was in fact governed by a system of rules rather than malice? Could routine replace brutality? The uncertainty itself was exhausting, undermining the psychological structures built by years of indoctrination. The soldiers were not free of fear, yet neither were they confronted by the extreme hostility they had anticipated. Observation of daily life revealed further contradictions. The prisoners noted cleanliness and hygiene as priorities for both themselves and their captors. Barracks were swept and maintained. Meals were cooked with attention to safety and nutrition. Medical staff attended to illness and injury with professionalism. The British system emphasized order and the predictable enforcement of rules, rather than cruelty. For men trained to equate authority with punishment, the clarity of expectations was alien. The predictable, calm environment produced a kind of psychological tension. Without crisis, without aggression, the mind continued to anticipate threats that did not materialize. Suspicion became a default state. As days turned into weeks, the mental impact of this environment deepened. POWs began to recognize patterns. Morning roll call followed the same routine. Work details adhered to precise schedules. Meals were consistent and sufficient. Yet, despite this regularity, there was no reprieve from internal anxiety. Soldiers had learned to anticipate the worst in every scenario. Now, in a land of quiet order, the expectation of malevolence persisted even in its absence. Diaries reveal men reflecting on the paradox. Their captors were competent and orderly, yet the certainty of punishment remained, internalized and unrelenting. This was a form of cognitive dissonance rarely documented outside wartime captivity. One of the most striking aspects was the interaction with camp personnel. Officers addressed prisoners with clear authority, but without aggression. Guards enforced rules, yet their tone was measured, professional, and devoid of malice. Even small gestures, a nod of acknowledgement, a brief instruction repeated patiently, confounded expectation. Soldiers, trained to fear every interaction with the enemy, often interpreted these acts as manipulative, a psychological test rather than genuine civility. The mental energy required to navigate this ambiguous reality contributed to an unanticipated form of stress, one rooted in uncertainty rather than direct threat. Work assignments further illustrated this psychological effect. Men were given responsibilities that required attention and cooperation, yet none were designed to demean or punish. The structured labor, combined with the absence of overt hostility, created a paradoxical tension. Prisoners experienced activity and engagement, but without the emotional validation of expected suffering. The human mind, conditioned to interpret effort under duress as confirmation of danger, now had to reconcile productivity with absence of threat. Each successful completion of a task without punishment incrementally undermined the internalized narratives of propaganda. Confusion, reflection, and disbelief became recurring companions. The observation of food distribution offers another insight. Meals, simple and adequate, were provided on regular schedules. Portions were measured, but never withheld. For prisoners conditioned to anticipate scarcity as a form of control and humiliation, this consistency was destabilizing. Some POWs described in letters the difficulty of eating without suspicion, every spoonful accompanied by a subtle mental calculation, anticipating reprisal or hidden intent. The ordinary act of nourishment became a lens through which indoctrination and reality collided. Hunger was replaced not by satisfaction, but by cautious observation. Cognitive dissonance intensified as the brain sought explanation for actions that defied expectation. Over time, the prisoners began to experience subtle, cumulative changes in perception. The absence of cruelty did not translate into comfort. Rather, it produced a slow, pervasive anxiety. Men noted the cleanliness of facilities, the politeness of personnel, and the predictable routine, yet interpreted these as layers of a complex hidden strategy. Suspicion persisted. Cognitive frameworks built over years of training and propaganda were not easily dismantled. Instead, the mind oscillated between recognition of normality and adherence to learned expectation. This tension created a mental state distinct from fear or relief, an uneasy equilibrium marked by constant internal assessment of reality against indoctrinated belief. Interaction among prisoners also reflected the psychological impact. Conversations often centered on attempts to reconcile expectation with observation. Older soldiers, with more experience and exposure to propaganda, encouraged caution and skepticism. Younger men, less conditioned, expressed bewilderment or fleeting hope. Shared observation did little to alleviate individual mental strain. Instead, it reinforced the complex social negotiation of perception. Acknowledging kindness or order risked appearing naive. Adhering to suspicion risked overlooking genuine decency. The prisoner's reality was defined as much by mental interpretation as by physical circumstances. Incidents outside the camp further complicated perception. Occasional forays into nearby villages revealed civilians going about daily life with minimal acknowledgement of prisoners. Shops operated normally, farmers tended fields, and children played without apparent fear or hostility. Soldiers had been told to expect aggression, derision, or ambush. The normalcy, rather than comforting, produced the quiet dissonance. For men trained to see danger in every human interaction, neutrality was a form of challenge. If no threat was visible, what unseen forces governed behavior? The absence of anticipated cruelty became a source of mental fatigue, as the mind struggled to maintain its previous framework in the face of contradictory evidence. The cumulative psychological effect of these experiences was profound. Diaries, letters, and post-war recollections indicate a gradual erosion of certainty. Soldiers began to understand that the enemy was not inherently malicious, that order could replace chaos, and that survival did not require constant anticipation of brutality. Yet this realization did not produce elation or relief. Instead, it generated a reflective, often uneasy mental state. Cognitive structures built through training and propaganda were dismantled slowly through observation, repetition, and analysis. The prisoners were not merely surviving physical captivity, they were navigating a profound psychological transition. By the middle of their internment, POWs displayed varying degrees of adjustment. Some began to participate in organized camp activities, educational programs, recreation, or supervised labor. Others remained cautious, mentally simulating potential threats in every interaction. The contrast between expectation and reality continued to shape behavior. The presence of calm, competent authority produced neither fear nor joy, but a subtle form of tension, a persistent questioning of reality, of certainty, and of previously held beliefs. This mental state would leave lasting impressions, shaping personal reflection long after the war ended. Medical records from the camps provide additional insight into this psychological landscape. Soldiers were treated for minor ailments, sleep disturbances, and stress-related symptoms. Many of these conditions did not arise from physical deprivation, but from the cognitive strain of constant mental vigilance in an environment that defied expectation. Psychologists reviewing these records post-war noted that the absence of overt cruelty was itself a stressor for men conditioned to anticipate malevolence. The paradox of humane captivity created a unique form of psychological shock, distinct from trauma inflicted through violence or deprivation. In letters sent home or recorded in diaries, prisoners often reflected on the disparity between reality and indoctrination. Some expressed disbelief. They had expected brutality, humiliation, and constant threat, yet encountered order, cleanliness, and civility. Others noted the difficulty of adjusting thought patterns shaped by years of propaganda. Even routine acts, receiving a meal, completing a task, or interacting with a guard, required reinterpretation through a new mental framework. The process was gradual, sometimes frustrating, and rarely accompanied by emotional relief. Instead, it fostered introspection, careful observation, and the reevaluation of prior assumptions. As months passed, the prisoners' understanding of their environment deepened. They began to recognize patterns. Work details followed schedules, meals were consistent, medical care was available, and guards maintained professional conduct. The cumulative effect was a subtle shift in perception. The rigid expectation of cruelty gave way to cautious observation. Soldiers learned to anticipate routine rather than punishment. Yet even as certainty weakened, the psychological residue of propaganda persisted. Suspicion, vigilance, and internalized fear did not vanish completely. Adjustment required constant mental negotiation between expectation and evidence. In retrospective accounts, many former POWs emphasize the enduring impact of this experience. The encounter with a system that adhered to rules rather than cruelty challenged deeply ingrained beliefs. Soldiers recognized the power of propaganda in shaping perception and the fragility of certainty when confronted with contradictory evidence. Some noted that the mental strain of adjusting to humane captivity rivaled the fatigue of combat itself. The absence of anticipated adversity forced introspection, analysis, and reflection, a process both unsettling and formative. Ultimately, the psychological experience of German POWs in Britain demonstrated that captivity could affect the mind as profoundly as the body. The expectation of brutality, ingrained through propaganda and training, created a lens through which every act was interpreted. The reality, orderly camps, polite guards, sufficient food, and routine, challenged these perceptions. The tension between belief and observation produced a unique form of mental strain, one characterized not by immediate danger, but by the slow, persistent erosion of certainty. Soldiers were confronted with the unfamiliar challenge of reconciling indoctrination with evidence, a process that reshaped understanding of enemy behavior, human norms, and the boundaries of expectation. As the war continued, the lessons of captivity endured beyond individual experience. Soldiers returned home with memories of a society that defied their expectations, challenging assumptions about human behavior under duress. The psychological shock they endured was subtle yet lasting, emphasizing that the power of belief could be as influential as physical circumstance. In quiet reflection, former prisoners noted that the absence of cruelty was itself a force to reckon with, a mirror held up to indoctrination and a testament to the complexity of human perception. The confrontation with reality, rather than brute force, had left its mark on a generation of men conditioned to fear, yet ultimately compelled to reevaluate what they had been taught. By the time the POWs had settled into routine life in the camps, they had absorbed a profound lesson. The world did not always conform to expectation. Their indoctrination had prepared them for horror. The British camps offered order. Their minds, trained for cruelty, found calm to be disorienting. The experience reshaped understanding, challenged certainty, and forced reflection. In a sense, the psychological confrontation, subtle, persistent, and internally negotiated, was the most profound form of captivity. The soldiers had crossed the channel expecting cruelty and found instead a world that demanded they rethink everything they thought they knew. And in that quiet, unassuming reality, they discovered not malice, but the unforeseen complexity of human behavior.